There we go. Welcome, everyone, to the League of Women Voters of Nashville's Hot Topics. Those of you who are here probably know that once a month, at the first Friday of each month at noon, we have people come to speak to us about various topics, hot in particular. Today is the first uh, Friday of September, and we have two people from the Nashville Banner. I am not a Tennessean. I am a Northerner, Wisconsinite. So I don't know about the history of the Banner, but I do know that in the past few years, the Banner has revived quite a bit, and it's really very exciting. I'm actually incredibly excited. And they also have a podcast, and I love to walk around my little greenway listening to podcasts. And so it's been very, very great to have this new and exciting thing happen, which my understanding is the two people who I will introduce eventually, I promise, will be discussing. So today we're going to have two people speaking about the history of the banner, as well as some issues around our Metro, State, Federal, and campaign finance databases and possibly specific examples of people around their finances. The two people we'll be having speak are Stephen Elliott, who attended the University of the South, also known as Sewanee, I think nowadays. And he's been around. He went to Idaho and Colorado before he came back and joined the Nashville Post and the Nashville Scene in 2016. And he's now part of the Banner. My understanding is the Banner and the Scene have been doing a lot of things together. So Stephen will be one of our speakers. The other speaker is Sarah Grace Taylor, who is a staff reporter also on the Banner. She is a native Nashvilleian from Hickory, Old Hickory, I believe she said. Anyway, and she spent several years outside on the West Coast, in Sacramento, in Seattle, and then came back to Tennessee for a while at Chattanooga with the Times Free Press. And I guess she started there and then went west. And now she's back again working for local news, which, by the way, is very exciting. The League of Women Voters is incredibly supportive of local news. And that's one of the other reasons I desperately, when I saw the campaign finance thing that you guys had put out, I really, really wanted you to come speak. The other thing I just want to tell you and tell people on this call is that whenever I speak to somebody, one of the about like various newspapers in Middle Tennessee. There's one in particular that people are kind of spit out of their mouth and say, "Well, yeah, it's that big thing and whatever it is," but then they immediately, almost in the last like year, have said the Banner is back. So I'm very excited to introduce both Sarah Grace and Stephen to discuss about the Banner and about campaign finance. Uh, just a reminder that next month, the first Friday, which is whatever the first Friday is in October, at noon, we will have somebody being discussing mis, and malinformation. And there will be more information coming out in the voter, and you can certainly also give me a buzz if you want to know more. And I will get that out to people so that we'll have that in October. And I think I promised in November, since it will be just before an event that happens on the next Tuesday afterwards, that we might have sort of some fun, kind of a fun thing, just to just to let out some steam and maybe, I don't know. I'm not exactly sure, but Melissa, I'm sure, knows how to do those sorts of things. By the way, in case people don't know, Melissa Hanson is also my partner in crime when it comes to hot topics. So anything you need to add, Melissa, other than I've now pointed to you?
No, I think we've got a lot of very interesting things coming up this year. It's what we'll call this year. So I'm looking forward to today's hot topic too. This has been a while in the making. So take it away.
Okay, I'm passing it over to Sarah Grace and Stephen.
Okay. Thanks for having us. I know we're both excited to talk to you guys. I'll speak for myself and say that I am not an expert in giving digital presentations. So bear with me if I falter on this screen sharing situation. Um, and I think it's fine with me if anyone has a question throughout to unmute and ask it. Obviously, we want to get through the stuff that we've prepared, but I think that would be fine. Karen, did you?
Yeah, feel free also to just add it to the chat, and then you can
Okay.
either you can bring it up as that would be, I think, the best thing if people could add it to the chat, and then if you at the end we can ask questions in the vocal range.
All right. So you can see. I'm going to take that as a yes.
Yeah, you're good.
Okay. I know it's an elaborate presentation we've got here, so you don't want to miss it. But yeah, I'm Stephen. Sarah Grace is here too. We're with the Nashville Banner, which I guess for some of you who've been around for a long time, you'll remember was a daily newspaper for over a century, I believe, that folded in the 1990s. It's been revived as a nonprofit newsroom, which is kind of this newer model that's becoming popular around the country. And we hope that it's the model of the future for local news. We're nonprofit. We're funded by donations from readers and organizations, and it's locally owned or locally controlled. And we try to do in-depth civic news, and that will this election cycle in particular, where we did a survey of our readers. So we asked them what issues they wanted to hear about and how they wanted to hear about them, and we're kind of responding to that with some of our stories, or we're trying to. So we're trying to be responsive. We're trying to be educational, how to register to vote, where to vote, what the ballot looks like, which I think maybe we share with your organization. We're not reliant on traffic or clicks or things like that. We don't have a paywall, so anything on our site you'll be able to access. And we're not owned by some big national chain that has different incentives than our local audience. That's kind of the gist. The best, this is at the end of the presentation too, but the best way I think to get our information is we have a daily newsletter. It comes out every morning at like 6 or 6:30 in the morning, and it has our stories for the day, and then it also has some smaller items and some links to some other sites with pretty much everything you need to know locally, I think. So if you just go to our site, there's a button that says newsletters, and you can sign up for that and get it every day. So we wanted to talk about campaign finance in the state of Tennessee. It can be very complex, even for us who look at it every day. We're going to try to take you through each of these sites. So as you know, you have your local representatives at city council and mayor, and then you have your state reps, state senators, and governor, and people like that at the state level, and then your federal representatives, Congress, members of Congress, and U.S. Senate. So they all have different reporting requirements, and it's all compiled in a different place as far as what they're raising and what they're spending. I think it's really important, and we'll get into some stories later about why we think it's important to pay attention to this stuff. But first, we want to show you kind of how to access it if those of you who maybe haven't played around on these sites. And I'm controlling the screen, but Sarah Grace is going to talk about the FEC. So I'm going to try to open up this and
you guys can feel free, if you have your computer and are interested in this, to kind of go along with us and see how to do it if you want.
Yeah. So yeah, take it away.
So the FEC is the Federal Election Commission, and that's going to be, like Stephen mentioned, all of your members of Congress or anyone holding federal office. It's probably the most user-friendly of the ones we'll show you today, which is good, unless you're looking at state stuff. But to look for a candidate, you'll go to the top left, and I'm doing this on my own computer while Stephen drives, so we might not be completely synced. Go to the top left where it says campaign finance data. In the drop-down menu there's a section called candidates, and that's usually the easiest place to start. go to all candidates and you can search for someone where it says candidate name or ID. We decided to pick on Andy Ogles. So we'll go search for Ogles, and then you get only one result because of a unique enough last name. If you click on his name, it'll take you to his main page where you can see a lot of different stuff. The first thing is just a summary of his overall receipts. So that's all of his contributions from individuals and PACs. And that's aggregate. And what he has left at the bottom is active as of the last time they filed, which is like the 3rd week of July, I think. You can get more specific on any of these categories where it says browse receipts at the top right there. You can click on that and see individual contributions. And then the same at the bottom where it says total spent. You can do that with his disbursements. So that's any money that the campaign spent. That can be stuff like mailers, that can be paying staff, that can be Ubers to an event. It varies pretty dramatically. Do you want to get into that stuff specifically, or do you want to show the overview stuff, Stephen?
Yeah, just tell me where to go, I think.
Okay. I think if you go to the top left of this Andy Ogles page, there's a section called filings. And if you click on that, you can download any individual reports. We're on different. Okay.
Yeah, well, I'm going to go here. So, and then just one thing to make clear, these people, they have their name is in there as an individual, but also their campaign committee. So you have to kind of toggle between the two sometimes. And I'm here on his campaign committee, and here are his filings.
So they have different deadlines throughout the year, quarterly reports, and then pre-primary and pre-general, where they have to report what they've raised and what they've spent. And you can see the individual ones, which is not always where you want to go, but if you're looking at stuff right after a deadline, that's where you want to download the newest report. Or in Ogle's case, where there's been amended reports because of inaccurate reports originally, it's a good place to go, and you can compare the different versions. And then another handy function that the FEC has that the other ones won't is if you go to this compare opposing candidates blue bar, which you've passed because you went to one.
Where?
If you go back to the list of filings. Okay, we're in a different spot. Hold on. Maybe we both shared.
I think I can go to another thing. They have it sort of simplified for users where you can go this. I think it'll compare the candidates if I go here, Sarah Grace. You go to find elections, and then you can click on your state. And then this funky looking dinosaur is the 5th District of Tennessee. And so you can see show all candidates. Is this what you were looking for?
Close enough. It's different, but yeah. And so obviously you're past the primary and you wouldn't want to look at Courtney Johnson necessarily, but it's a good way to look at Ogles and Miriam, and you can compare the two of them. And if you go down, there's even a map function where you can see who's getting donations from outside of the state, who's getting more independent expenditures and PAC donations, and get a better sense of how the different candidates are raising money and who's giving that to them. And that's kind of the overview of the FEC site.
And this, for reference, is what the actual report looks like. They're usually in PDF form, and they can be, you look at some of them and they're like 700 pages long. Like I think Gloria Johnson's are really long because she gets a bunch of $20 donations. This one's only 23 pages, but it has all the pertinent information of who the candidate is, how much they raised in this period, how much they spent in this period. And then when you scroll down, you can look at actually, well, you can find this on the regular site too, but if you want the, full, most detailed version, it'll be in here, and you can see who these people are, where their address is, and what who their employer is, which can be interesting as far as who gave. And then at the bottom will be where they spent all the money.
And this is on the last slide, we'll give you guys some extra resources. There's also a website called Open Secrets that I think is maybe even more user-friendly. And they just aggregate FEC data, and you can look there to see which employers overall have the most donations, and that's an interesting way to see like what industries and employers are donating to a candidate.
You want to go to state?
Sure.
Okay. Okay, the state site doesn't have as clean of a URL, but here we are. You can usually just Google Tennessee campaign finance, Nashville campaign finance, and find it. But this is the link if you want to write it down or bookmark it.
And if you're looking at a candidate overall versus specific report, you would hit candidate and you'd put in their last name. We'll do Chad Bobo. You don't have to fill out all this other information about their party, but you do have to select what election year you're looking. It works a lot better if you do that. Sorry, I'm trying to check, make sure we're in the same spot this time. If you hit report list, when you get to your candidate, it shows you the individual reports. It does not do aggregation like the FEC website, so you can't see that fancy total stuff that we got on the front end with Ogles, but you can do that yourself by looking at the reports. The most recent report for these candidates running for the state was the end of July, which is the pre-primary report. That one's kind of a short report because it only accounts for the time after the second quarter is reported, which goes through the end of June. So this is really only a couple of weeks in July captured in that report. But we can look at it as an example. Sorry, that was my cat. So if you get to these reports, they show you the beginning balance, which is how much money the candidate or campaign had at the beginning of the period that we're looking at. And then it shows you all of the individual contributions, who gave it. They also show the title and job. And then the amount. And then if you get to the bottom, it shows you the total contributions they received in that time period, and then what they spent as well. Which leaves them with what's left on hand at the bottom. So that's the amount of money that they have after this time period between what they received, what they started with, and then what they spent. Again, it's not nearly as detailed as the FEC website, but it's not the worst state one either. So, yeah. And I think you can show them the city.
Yeah. Another thing you can do on the state, if you know your district, you can say, I think that Bobo's in 60, right? So you scroll, there's 99 House districts. So you can just put in 60 and you'll see all the candidates. I usually click a few of these because it's nice to be able to see. So these are all the people who've filed campaign reports for that district, which is, what is that, where you were born? You're in District 60, Sarah Grace? This is
Actually,
like,
I'm not in District 60 because I was on the Wilson County side of Old Hickory.
okay,
right,
well, this is like Old Hickory and Hermitage area. And
Johnson.
Darren Jernigan has been the state rep there for a long time, and he's not running again. So all these other people are, or some of them have since dropped out or lost their primaries. But you can see, for instance, Chad Bobo's the Republican. You can click on his, and then Shondell Brooks is who won the Democratic nomination. And you can click on hers there. You want to look at local? Okay, so Davidson County is probably the worst of the three. Funny enough, as Sarah Grace and I were discussing this earlier, she made the astute point that there doesn't appear to be, how did you put it?
There's not, I think some people would assume that there's a party correlation between when transparency is good on these issues, and that is not true in my experience. So just because you might perceive Nashville as being pro-democracy or whatever other assumptions you have about the government there does not mean it's necessarily more efficient or transparent.
Right. And if you look at, if you live in another county, your county probably has something similar to this. Essentially, the Nashville one is just a list of PDFs. There's no way to search donations. None of this feature doesn't really work. I mean, look, the only election here is that one, which there have been 20 other ones that I can remember since this site went live. But here are all the candidates. They did add this status of active and inactive, which is sort of helpful to weed out the things that are old. But you can just scroll through and you can see all the different stuff that's in here. So there's court clerk positions. These are county level positions usually. There's also some of the cities that are within Davidson County, like Bellmead and Berry Hill. Their candidates can be in here. And then all these are Metro Council candidates. You can see there's just some of these are from 4 years ago, which is why it's not that helpful or it's kind of annoying. But then there are also the more recent ones. So all Metro Council, Metro Council. I'm gonna scroll down to the mayor since that one people are more familiar with maybe. But here are all the at-large candidates for council from both 2019 and 2023. Judges, I mean, this is just a lot of stuff. Okay, so these are all people that have run for mayor either this time or last time. And here's Freddie O'Connell, who won. And you just click on their name and all these reports come up. There's not a good way, like with the FEC, to search for donors or search for expenditures. You just kind of have to do it manually, which is a pain. But let's see. The most recent one's not that interesting because this is from after he was elected in September. So these two are kind of just his account exists, but he's not actively raising and spending money. So these interim reports are in kind of the days immediately before an election. There's certain requirements that you have to report big donations or expenditures kind of immediately so that people don't have to wait for the final report. But let's find so pre-general, this would have been before the runoff or before the first round of voting. So maybe a bigger one. Click on it. You can see it's similar to the FEC file. You can see the treasurer. You can see this covered. This was a year and change ago, but it covered 3 weeks in July before. So it's sort of similar to the other ones, but you can see like what he had on hand coming into this period, how much he raised, and he spent a lot. And that left him with not so much, but clearly that worked. And again, it's kind of annoying because you really do have to scroll and read through. This one's 170 pages compared to that 23-page one from earlier. But you can find, I mean, some of you might be in one of these, but you can find people you can find prominent local officials. One thing that's always interesting in reports like this, when there's a contested election, sometimes elected officials will be shy about, publicly endorsing someone, but they'll give them a few $100s. So you can find that and say, oh, well, this politician I like donated to this person, so maybe I like them too. But it's also just a lot of random people. And when you're donating to a campaign, you should probably be aware that your name and address and employer might be listed on a public document for someone like me to find later. Yeah, so the Metro one is the worst of the three, I would say.
So you were, as a question about this, you were saying that Davidson Metro is not great. Is there any in Tennessee that are better?
Well, I've mostly only covered either state races or races in Davidson County. I'd ask Sarah Grace since she was working in Hamilton County. I don't know. Do you remember what that system was like, if it was any better?
I think it might be slightly better, but it's pretty comparable. And I think cities and counties have less bandwidth to have a really sophisticated website overall. Yeah. So I don't think these are particularly bad ones compared to other localities, but the local ones are always a little worse and they have fewer functions.
I do think that there are some, especially small counties, that probably don't even have a digital footprint. You would have to, call the county clerk or go to their office in person to get some of these and get them emailed to you. I would imagine. I think that was the case at my job in Colorado. They didn't have an online depository. It was a repository. But yeah, and I do think a lot of you'll find, like, you can see this is called easycampaignfinance.com. I imagine that other counties in the state have used the same vendor, so it might look the exact same. Because that's the case with some court stuff and some other stuff around the state.
I realized we missed a couple of questions in the chat.
Okay.
Karen, you asked when the pre-general report is due. So the next report that will be due for state candidates is the third quarter report, which will cover the beginning of July through September 30th. And that's due, I think, the 10th of October. And then the pre-general one would be like the very last week of October. So those pre-election ones really just capture about 2 weeks, 10 days, something like that, after the reports are filed, but before the election comes. They're still interesting, even though they're short, though, because sometimes campaigns will deliberately do a lot of their spending in that short period, thinking that it wouldn't necessarily get the same attention. And then the other question is, amending a report could be expected, but is there any penalty or reprimand for multiple amendments to the same report? So the Tennessee Election Commission can reprimand people for missing deadlines on the reports or for not filing. I don't know if they can for having to do amendments. I think that's usually the solution that they come to when they talk to these people who have missed a deadline or missed a filing, is to get them to amend it or to make it accurate, not to reprimand them outside of that.
Yeah, and
They might see differently though.
the FEC is not just this repository; it's an actual commission that are members of it. In Washington, there's a state kind of equivalent that's also made up of people that meet and discuss these things, and both of them are kind of inconsistent in their enforcement. They don't have huge staffs or investigators or things like that, even in Washington. So a lot of times it'll be like, please, please, please do better, as opposed to the FEC coming down hard on Andy Ogles, for instance, for amending these things over and over again. Although the FBI does seem to be paying attention, which is a whole nother level. Like when it goes from an election finance citation to like a actual crime. Though, I mean, obviously we don't know if there's been a crime there, but those are like two separate lanes of enforcement.
But the administrative stuff, like missing a deadline or whatever, is usually just a fine. And if you listen to the commission meetings, typically if a candidate comes and explains why they missed it, the fine is waived. There's not really much of
And some of the examples we'll talk about later are some pretty egregious mess ups, intentional or otherwise, that the registry here in Tennessee is just kind of like, this seems bad. Please don't do that. So yeah, we'll look at some of those in a minute.
And in the registry's defense, part of it is their legislative authority is pretty limited. They don't have a lot they can't do if they wanted to.
Yeah, and they don't have, as I said, investigators who can go look. And there's been an issue lately where they asked the state attorney general to look into something, and the attorney general was like, it's not really our job. And so the registry just kind of threw their hands up and said, okay, well, moving on. So it's not a perfect system, to say the least.
Oh, right. So we wanted to look at Tennessee's laws and how they compare to other places. And overall, I would say the campaign contribution limits, the filing requirements, the really basic stuff seems to be about middle of the road. It's not the most lackadaisical, but it isn't the least. They're not on top of it. You don't report necessarily as frequently as some other states. But what I did notice when I was looking is that it's changed a lot in recent years. So I was looking at the laws around PACs specifically, which is political action committees, which are the groups who are able to pump more money in than individuals can for someone's campaign. And it seems like the theme is that in the last 12 or 15 years, Tennessee has shifted toward allowing more PAC spending. I put in here that in 2011, they raised it for the first time since 1996. And when they raised the limits that they could spend, they raised it up to $107,000. And then now today, a state Senate candidate can receive up to $286,000 from PAC. So it's pretty significant in the same time period that they hadn't even adjusted it at all before 2011. Your gubernatorial candidates don't even have a limit on how much PAC money they can receive. It just can't exceed 50% of their total receipts. So as long as they're also receiving that much from individuals, there's not a dollar figure that they can't exceed. So the outside spending has gone up significantly in that time frame, specifically since 2016, when vouchers became an issue in Tennessee, because the voucher groups have a lot of national equivalents. Several of them are national groups that just have state offshoot groups in Tennessee. And so the way that works is the national groups raise all this money from anybody. It doesn't have to be Tennessean. It doesn't have to be related necessarily to a Tennessee race. And then they'll cut just one or two big checks for the whole amount of money that they raised and give them to the state groups. And then the state groups can spend the money without it being easily tied to whoever donated it. So we've written a bit about that this year. And that was certainly also the case during the primary this year, where these voucher groups spent almost $5 million in Tennessee. I think we're probably ready for the next slide, Stephen. Oh, okay.
It's the mixed results with the spending.
Yeah, mixed results. The PAC groups, the PACs that are pro-voucher spent a lot of money on Republican primaries this year and didn't necessarily clean up proportionate to how much money they spent. So it's not clear if it's going to do them any good when it comes to passing voucher legislation next year. But with this going on, the Tennessee Registry of Election Finance and the Ledge have kind of been going back and forth with different legislation, especially since like 2022, in ways to either make this outside money more transparent or to limit the spending of this outside money. It seemed like they made a little progress in 2022, and then there was a cleanup bill that passed that changed language just enough to obscure the individual donors, because it says it has to be a direct contribution, which means those indirect contributions I told you about coming from these national groups don't necessarily go back to the individuals who gave the money. And then there's been several bills that have come up in the legislature that might have addressed this but failed. There was a bill that would have limited outside contributions. It failed. There was a bill that would have cut down the number of times that they report throughout the year, but would have required candidates to report all contributions regardless of the dollar amount, which would have helped with transparency, but that failed. And then there's another bill right now that's a carryover bill from last year that would remove the pre-primary and pre-general reports altogether. So those short reports where they dump a lot of money at the end of the campaign could theoretically not happen if they get rid of those. The money would still be reported after the fact. So even after November's election, there will still be a Q4 report that will come out, but then it's a little late because people have already been elected. So, just something to watch on the transparency and election finance front.
I can't see the question. Were there any other questions before we move on?
Someone said, is that total or per PAC? That's total. So when I'm talking about the amounts that someone can receive, there are also per PAC amounts, but I just included the aggregates. Is outside money spent to kill effort? Is outside money spent to kill efforts to limit outside money? That's a good question. I think a lot of this administrative transparency stuff kind of happens within the session. And it's not like people don't run on platforms about campaign transparency. So I don't really think it happens that way where people are spending. But I do think, there are more moderate or more good government centric candidates who suffered in primaries in recent years because they weren't on this extreme side that's getting most of the outside spending. So in an indirect way, maybe, but no, I don't think that's like a specific campaign. I would say we said that it's not by party that you see these transparency things happen, but I do think And if you look at the timeline in Tennessee, it's pretty clear that when there's a supermajority that's really safe is when you see this kind of stuff happen. It's like gerrymandering or something, where if they can pass policies to stay in control, they will when they have this kind of number of people. So it's not just Republicans. I'm sure Democrats do it in other states too. But no, I don't think people are directly spending money with the idea of killing Todd Gardenhire's financial report bill.
And when it comes to people screwing up, that is certainly bipartisan, as we'll explore here. So we good to move on, Sarah Grace? Okay. I don't expect you to read all of these examples. I just wanted to have them here so we could go through a few. I think these are examples that help me think about like why looking at these reports and following this stuff is important, because people are screwing around a lot. And sometimes it's like super nefarious, and it's, to do the bidding of some entity. Sometimes it's just a simple mistake, or this person doesn't have a good accountant. And sometimes it's just they wanted to buy a new car, and they, use the campaign money to do that, which is actually legal here. And so some of these are just some like stories that were pretty big in the last several years in Tennessee and in Nashville, that can kind of illustrate why this stuff's important. I think if you've been following Tennessee politics for a while, you might recognize this guy, Jeremy Durham. He was a up and coming state prominent conservative in Williamson County. I was talking to a veteran reporter about this the other day in preparation for this talk, and his personal problems. He sexually harassed a dozen people at the Capitol, I believe, or more. There was this whole investigation about it. It was all about, most of the controversy was about that. But this veteran reporter I talked to said that there were a lot of his fellow Republicans who were not willing to kick him out of the legislature for that stuff. But once all this campaign finance stuff came out, they quickly, jumped on the bandwagon of getting him kicked out. So you may have heard of his more colorful discretions, but he also was using his campaign account for lots of different things. I mean, look, you can see dry cleaning, sunglasses, his personal stuff, and he was levied the biggest fine ever by the registry. I don't think it's been collected yet. It's been litigated for many years in the time since, but it was over $400,000 at the time. And this information comes from the Tennessee Journal, which is a really good source. It's mostly for like lobbyists, insiders, political people. But if you're like super interested in this stuff, I would recommend subscribing to that. I think it's kind of expensive, but if that's your thing, then this publication has a lot of really kind of granular information about these cases. But you can see it is quite bipartisan. This is just kind of a summary of some recent flubs in the campaign finance world in Tennessee. Some people were not turning in their reports. Joe Towns of Memphis is notorious for that. He, for years, would not turn in reports, and the registry say, please turn them in. And eventually, if you have outstanding fines with the registry, you can't run for re-election, which is obviously a big incentive to turn those in on time and to get the fines paid. But the registry will sometimes say, okay, well, we're not going to keep you off the ballot. We know you're working hard on this, so we'll, waive some of the fees or forgive some of them. It looks like, Harold Love, who's a Nashville Democrat, he sort of similar, had spent some of his campaign money on dry cleaning, jewelry. They ended up not doing anything about that. I think he argued that some of it was for constituents, which is kind of this weird gray area that, you do dry cleaning for your constituents. I guess that's political in some way. I don't know. This case has been all over the news for several years now. Brian Kelsey he was good buddies with Jeremy Durham. In fact, when they were both in the legislature, he was another kind of rising star in the Tennessee conservative world, state senator from Shelby County. And he ran for Congress in 2016 when he was in the state Senate. So he was trying to kind of level up. And he was, I think, at the time he was maybe trailing a little in polls, and he was struggling to raise as much money as some of the others. And you can't transfer money from your state campaign to a federal campaign. There are some campaigns you can transfer to. I believe you could, if you're a state candidate and you're running for mayor, you could transfer the money down, but you can't. There's federal laws about transferring money from a state campaign to a federal campaign. So he, according to investigators, he transferred money through a conduit, and then that entity spent money on behalf of his campaign, and that is illegal. And he pleaded guilty eventually. Well, at first he said it was a political witch hunt. Then he ultimately pleaded guilty once one of his co-conspirators flipped on him. And then he tried to take back his guilty plea. And now the judges are, in fact, I think there was a ruling this week from the appeals court that said, no, you can't take back your guilty plea. So that's moving forward. So that was a pretty creative one. I think it was the Tennessean, some of their now departed reporters who kind of pieced it together that, hey, this exact amount of money went from here to here to here. And that's now been almost 10 years that we've been talking about this case. So to Sarah Grace's point about vouchers and school choice money, in 2016, the Nashville school board, there was a big Nashville school board election, and it was really kind of dramatic. Some of you were around, you may remember, it was kind of dramatically about charter schools and school choice. And some of the incumbent board members were more pro, traditional public schools, and were kind of not being as friendly to new charter applications as some of these groups wanted them to be. So they put forward, so a bunch of candidates ran on the platform of, we would be for school choice, we'd be for charter schools and metro schools. And all this money got dumped into the race, tons of money, especially for a school board election, which are normally pretty sleepy. And all those candidates ended up losing, but people complained that they thought there was illegal coordination between these groups and the candidates, just because of the way the money was being directed and kind of connections between some of these people. It's like, you can't coordinate, a PAC can't coordinate with a candidate even. There's all these PACs that support Donald Trump and Kamala Harris, and you can give a bunch of money to them, and they spend, and they buy ads that say, please vote for Kamala Harris or Donald Trump. But the campaign can't coordinate with those outside groups. And that's the same here locally. So people were saying, no, this is wrong. They dumped all this money in and coordinated. And the registry said, we don't have enough evidence for that. So let's just move on. And again, I think, I'm not saying that this group did anything wrong, but the registry does not have a lot of investigative power. So they weren't going out and subpoenaing document bank records and stuff. I don't think. It's kind of just like a he said, she said situation in a lot of cases. This case is maybe a little less well known, and I actually wrote this story, so that's why it's kind of stuck in my head. It's from 2018, and this is a case where no crime was alleged, no investigation was launched. But I just wanted to use that as an example for, there's sometimes where like you see things and you're like, this seems weird or fishy, and it may never get brought to any sort of ethics board or campaign finance board. This Scott Davis was a city council member, and he was running for a vacant state house seat. And there were all these instances of him as a city council member, using that platform of elected office to go before Metro zoning board and speak on behalf of these developers. And then either that day or the next day, that developer would cut a check to his state campaign. Like, that seems strange. He'd also bought a home from one of the developers, who then turned around and gave him a donation. And And he actually, and this was a big issue in 2018 because he was representing this neighborhood in East Nashville that had all this development, and there were a lot of people who were concerned about displacement, and they said his ties to developers were, bad for the community because he was kind of supporting their interests over the residents' interests. But he said it was actually, this is a quote I found from a Facebook video that he put out. He said, no, it's actually good that I have these relationships because he can call up these developers and say, hey, we've got this church that needs a new roof. We've got this old lady who needs, their front step fixed. And can you cut a $500 check for him? And the developer in question did actually cut a $500 check that day, but it was to his campaign, not to a church lady. But this case never, this was not even a case. It was just something I wrote about. So there are instances where this is just something that's going on that's not even rising to the level of nightly news attention or any sort of investigative authority. But hopefully we can continue to pay attention to it. And I would, if you do find this stuff interesting and start poking around on these websites and you find anything interesting, I would suggest that Sarah Grace or I be your first call when you find something fishy. Do you want to? Well, so yeah, as I mentioned at the beginning, nashvillebanner.com/newsletters, you'll get our daily newsletter, which has all of our election coverage, other stuff too, links to other sites. This book, if some of you have maybe heard of it, it's called Welcome to Capitol Hill. It came out last year. It's by Eric Schultzig, who is at the Tennessee Journal. He was at the Associated Press for a long time, and Joel Ebert, who I think helped break that story about Brian Kelsey. He's not in journalism anymore, but it kind of recounts a lot of controversies at the state legislature over the last 50 years, including a lot of this campaign finance stuff, and explains it in a really kind of easy to understand way. But you can find that book around town. The Tennessee Lookout made this database that's really interesting. If you just Google Tennessee Lookout Cash for Clout, it compiles all of the interest groups donations over, I think, the last like 20 years. I don't know, Sergey, if you poked around on it, but you can type in like AT&T or your employer, for instance, and see what they've donated. This is, as we said when we looked at the state site, this is not really easy to do on the state site. So they actually compiled all this stuff for us. And I think they update it periodically. But you could look up like Bill Lee and see which interest groups had donated to him, or you could vice versa, look up an interest group and see where they were going. And you want to talk about these last two?
Oh yeah. Open Secrets is the site I mentioned earlier, and they're really good for federal candidates specifically. And they're not a commission. They're not someone who has to have the reports, but what they do is take the FEC reports and aggregate them in several, I think, pretty helpful ways. Like I mentioned, you can look at which companies are the biggest contributors. It's a really good way to look at which PACs are giving to multiple candidates and see how that's being spent. And then if you go to like Marsha Blackburn, for example, you can sort by highest and lowest donation. So you can look like industry, company, like who's giving the most, which is interesting if you want to see like who's working with crypto and talk about crypto policy or, things like that. And then the one at the bottom is just an FEC function called FEC Notify. And you create an account, it's free, and you can subscribe to any candidates that you're interested in, and you get a notification, which you can customize for what kind of form they file. But you get a notification whenever they file new information. So in the example of someone like Ogles, who's had to go back and file amended things that weren't necessarily at the deadline that you'd be looking for them to be filed, you'd be aware that there was a new filing, and you could go look at it as soon as it comes out. Maybe only reporters care about doing that, but it's just handy if you do want to follow any candidate.
And I think that's what we've got. I'm not seeing any new questions in the chat, but if anyone has any, please let us know.
Anybody, please feel free to jump in if you have a question, or raise your hand, or send another note to anybody out there. You all know. Dick, are you interested in speaking? Or you have a question? You have to unmute yourself. Mr. Williams, you have to unmute yourself if you want to ask a question. There you go.
No, sorry. I just had to go screen blank for a while and it's coming back. I could hear in the background that
Oh,
another.
okay. I have a question. Maybe the two of you could answer. I notice on some of the candidates, particularly for the federal, that you see a lot of Win Red and Act Blue.
Mhm.
Are those things that are actually individuals that give through those, or are
Yeah.
they?
So, well, the Democrats created Act Blue, I don't know, a decade ago, and it's like an app or a company that pretty much every progressive candidate in the country uses on their site to collect donations. And then it was so successful that Republicans created WinRed a few years ago to kind of copy it. But it's just a conduit. So you'll see a lot of reports, federal reports, they're so long in part because it's kind of complicated, but they'll list like a donation from Act Blue for $4.
Right.
And then right below, it'll have an asterisk and it'll say earmarked. And then right below it, it'll be John Smith from Nashville, Tennessee, $4. So and then they'll do the same thing for every single thing they got from Act Blue. So yeah, it's just a conduit basically. Whenever you see Act Blue, it's usually tied to an individual donation. A lot of times, small dollar donations because the big guys are going to just write a check for $2,700 or whatever it is.
Right, that's what I was wondering about. But so you can find the individual even though they've given it through Act Blue or Win Red.
It's usually right below it.
I see. Okay, great. Well, this has been incredibly great. So, what's your plan in the next couple of months for how you're going to keep us all up to date on this stuff? How are you planning on doing it? Are you putting out, other than your newsletter? I think the newsletter is mostly the way you're going to do. Are you also going to be putting out any,
Yeah.
ongoing articles and such?
Oh yeah, of course. And the newsletter is usually linking off to full articles, so you kind of get the first couple paragraphs, and you can go read the rest of it if you're interested. But so we're doing these issue stories, and I think Sarah Grace has a couple coming up, and I've got one more coming up because that's kind of what our readers said they wanted. So we're going to look at different issues that always come up in election season, but especially this election season. So like, I think we have one about crime coming up, inflation, education, all these issues that come up in campaigns, and look at, what the context for those issues are. Like what are the facts? Like what is inflation? What is the cost of living? How has it changed? Whose fault is it? If there is any fault to be assigned. I'm just saying the inflation one because I'm doing that one. And then also looking at the different candidates and seeing what if they have any specific proposals or if they just kind of talk about it in a campaigny way or if they're actually proposing to do something about it. So that'll be that's one thing we're focused on right now. But in terms of campaign finance, we'll keep doing this types of stories that I think you saw that got you to ask us to do this. But when there are big deadlines coming up, it's not as we said. I mean, we saw Courtney Johnson. She had a lot more money for most of the period against Andy Ogles in the primary, and she ended up losing. So it's a good example of campaign finance not being the end all be all in these campaigns. People, you don't always win if you have more money. But it is interesting, I think, to look at and see who's supporting who, what they're spending their money on, whether they're filing their reports on time. Kind of gives you a window into whether they're a responsible person, I think. Sarah Grace, do you have anything?
I think the issue stories, we did stuff this on all of these candidates before the primary. So we already have voter guides and bios and stuff you can look at on our website. So that's good, like basic information if you haven't really tuned in until now and you're trying to figure out who these people are. And then in October, when the new filings come out, we'll of course write similar stuff to what we did this summer when it comes to finance.
Yeah, we have the voter guide with it's bios of the different candidates, and we're getting questionnaires, I think, together now of like asking all the candidates kind of the same questions, so you can compare and contrast. This person says they'll do this about reproductive health. This person says this, um, and we also have a bunch of information about like how to register to vote, what the deadlines are, where your polling place is, all the like super basic stuff that I think you guys are interested in.
Yeah, we have an app called 411, Vote 411, that we also keep up and try to use that for across the nation for people to basically figure out if they're registered and if we can get their candidates to put in their descriptions of who they are and what they are, we can put those in as well.
Could be a
I,
challenge.
yeah, I have a question though about you were mentioning the difference between the prime money that was raised by Ms. Johnson and Mr. Ogles. And did Ogles have uh, a beginning amount of money that wasn't just raised? So he had I don't know if you call it, he had cash on hand, basically.
Yeah, well, that's part of the issue that's being investigated right now, I think, because in 22, when he first ran, he said he had this $300,000 loan, which was kind of a big base amount of money um, at the time, and he's raised and spent since then. But that $300,000 was still kind of built into the totals that you saw, and it wasn't until a couple months ago that he said actually that $300,000 was never there. So it was kind of hard to really tell how much money he had because he didn't seem to even know. But in the kind of the time right up the like last couple months of the election, Courtney Johnson raised a lot more money than he did.
I see.
Because she was getting a lot of support from these like big real estate people and more like kind of traditional Republicans who don't like him.
Well, any other questions anybody has? Speak now or basically send emails
Yeah.
to uh, Stephen and or Sarah Grace. Y'all, this has been fantastic. And I, again, cannot say how excited I am that we have that the banner is revived and it's back and it's a local group. And that what I also love is you're pointing to other like Tennessee lookouts. I mean, it's like a coordination and I think it's just great. I think it's fantastic. It makes my heart go pitter patter to realize that we have people on the ground doing this kind of stuff. So I really, really appreciate you coming and speaking. And I think you guys are great. You did a fantastic job at these days.
Thank you.
And as I put in
Another question.
I'm sorry, Dick. Yes.
Yeah, sorry I had to turn off for a while. Did you get into the Registry of Election Finance data on their because they have more detail than the local county uh, that I saw you looking at.
Yeah, we look.
Unfortunately, I haven't looked at it in quite a while, but uh, they they uh, they have, I think, more data on at least statewide candidates.
We did. We showed the FEC for federal candidates, the election finance for state candidates, and then we also showed the local. But links for all of that will be in our slides, which I think it's fine if we share.
Okay, good. I missed that then when I had
Yeah,
away.
I will share.
Well, if you send your slides to me or whatever, I can also make them available when we put them on the website. Or people can also, usually people know who I am, and so they can send me email, or they can always email you. I mean, who knows?
I will send you the link. I don't know that it's quite
Let's
up
not
to
publish.
par for publication, but feel free to share it around.
Well, what I might do